Okay, everyone, welcome to Abstraction Ladders. We're lucky enough today to be joined by Rachel. Hey, Rachel.
Hi, I'm excited to be here.
So Rachel's going to tell us all about what I think, if I perceived it correctly, is your favorite exercise.
I think it is the most powerful tool that a designer or really anybody can learn because it is such a great framework to guide thinking.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about this mysterious but apparently all-knowing and all-conquering abstraction ladder.
I think that it is a tool that helps you to put problems in context in two different ways. So when you're trying to figure out where you want to start with a big problem, or you have a narrow problem you're not gaining traction on, an abstraction ladder can help you to put it into that bigger context to see what are the patterns, what's the system that it's embedded within, or see really concretely how can this play out in a specific context.
Excellent. Okay, so high level, in an abstraction ladder, I'm starting with some sort of a topic. Now, would I start with a topic like classroom or coffee mug? Like, what's at the center of my universe here in an abstraction ladder?
You know, I think it's always a Goldilocks problem where you're either at that place where you're trying to find this middle ground starting place, but it's really hard, I think, for people to do. We're all so embedded in the problems that we're working on that it's often hard to figure out, should I go bigger? Should I go smaller? So my intuition is to start with what you know. Start at that center point of your problem, your project space, whatever it is that you're working on.
Okay.
And then the tool will guide you and you'll start to feel, okay, where should I actually be?
Okay, so let's make this, no pun intended, a little concrete.
Beautiful.
So what's a topic or an area or a category that might be in the middle or the kind of common ground? Like not too high level as abstracted out in the full ladder, and also not so concrete that we're focused myopically on it.
Yeah, so say you were trying to reinvent the processes at the DMV, for example.
Okay. So the Department of Motor Vehicles,
Yes.
I'm unfortunately afraid to say that I think there's lots of processes we need to reinvent, but let's say we're welcoming for electronic vehicles to come.
Yes, so maybe you're trying to improve that experience. Maybe you're trying to improve what is it like for a new person to a state to register at the DMV.
Okay.
You could start with one specific element of the DMV that you want to focus on, like onboarding.
Okay.
And so that could be where your starting place is. Then you want to ladder up to say, why is this a problem we're solving?
Okay, so let me say it back to you before we get too far down the way. I, like many people, have had to get their license in order to get to a job, move kids around in my case, etc. One of the many things that I'm going to experience with the DMV is physically going and taking my test, which I'm thinking of as onboarding, right? So I had to get a permit before I could ultimately get my license.
Yep.
Now, that permit process is admittedly not the first thing I did, and it's not the last. Is that the right way to think about kind of this, where I am in the range of the ladder?
I think it's a place where it really depends on what you feel most strongly is the core of that problem as that starting.
Okay, definitely passing my permit test was the start of that.
Passing your permit test, if that's where you feel like the change needs to happen, I think part of it is a intuition game, which is not super helpful, I think, for people who are new to the process, but it's really about finding what is that place that I care about, that I think there's a there.
Okay, well, I'll introduce my cheat code to all of this, which is the place where I experience the most pain or have the most anxiety or adrenaline. so let's assume that the permit process largely works that, and I'm in my middle of my ladder. Now, you had started to take us on a journey to go up in this ladder. What does that actually mean as far as what you're really doing?
I would say that it's looking at that concept. So if it's for, in our example, the permit process, I would reflect and say, okay, so why is this important, or what is sitting above this one level? So in the permit process, if you ladder up one level, say your starting point is how might we improve the permit process to make people feel confident?
Fair enough.
That permit process is your center point. If you ladder up one level, you're saying, why do we care? Why do we want Adam to feel confident about moving through that permit process? You want to take a step and say, what's that next level up? So depending on the different directions, you might think reasons it's important we're solving because you want people to be successful in their application, because you want people to have efficiency, because you want people, some of those outcomes can be starting points to do that one ladder
I
up.
see. So what you're highlighting for me here is you start with a place where you're comfortable, where you're experiencing pain, adrenaline, or anything in between. And you say, okay, what's this a bigger part of as a system? Now, as we work up this ladder, I appreciated you're giving me a lot of credit here to saying, okay, the permit is part of a successful application. That application leads to a driver's license. That driver's license now, see, for me, that would lead to a job. Is that something that can be on my abstraction ladder, or is that completely out of bounds?
Definitely. I think it's a place where you don't want to put false constraints on what's there.
Okay.
I find when people ladder up enough levels, they typically get to high-level outcomes such as world peace or happiness, because that's laddering really far up. That's a place where you tend to be in in that space where it's kind of a too big problem to solve.
Well
in
said.
that Goldilocks side of things, it's you'd be asking a question like, how do we end childhood obesity?
Okay.
That's a huge problem space, really abstract, important, but that's a place where you can ladder up to just see where is this problem of the permit process? What system is that sitting within?
Okay, got it. So if I think about taking your example and extrapolating, or more or less saying it back, we start with the permit process. That could vary depending on maybe my citizenship status or my financial socioeconomic conditions and the like. But I'm gonna have this experience and I'm gonna ladder it, quite literally, like you said, all up to the idea of economic development. Let's say it's one of those truly global issues. But now I'm at the top of my ladder and I'm gonna climb down my rungs to the permit test. What's below all that? Like, why would I go down the ladder?
Yeah, I think that going down gives you a place of doing two things. It forces you to ask the question of how is this problem being solved today?
Okay,
how can you
question.
understand what's the factors that went into the permit process? Every system is designed. It's just whether that design is intentional or not.
Sure.
And so you're starting to surface what are those concrete factors that influence the permit process in our example. You might also look as when you're trying to ladder down or get more concrete as things that are stopping you from solving this problem today. What are barriers that are preventing someone from addressing problems in that space as well?
So we talked about permit and moving all the way up to maybe global mobility or workforce development or economics in some lens, but what are literally some of the values that might be under the permit process or the permit rung?
Yeah, absolutely. So some of the things that if you think about what's stopping you from improving the permit process today, or how are we solving it? Things like, what is that test process? Who are the people that are involved in conducting the test? What does the study process look like to get you to that? Or what are specific questions? For a friend of mine who was an international student when I was in grad school, when she was going through the permit process, all the units were in feet and inches. And she's in the metric system. So for her, she wasn't paying attention to those elements. So those really small factors, that's where we're getting more and more concrete. And the goal of getting more concrete is to say, because at times it's, if I don't solve this underlying issue, I'm never going to improve the permit process.
I see.
If it's always, a scary, intimidating thing, you could also capture the emotions that are at those lower rungs. If that frame never changes, then you're never going to be able to improve what you want to overall.
Really well said. So let's take my example of when I happened to be aspiring to get a permit for a motorcycle. So the first thing I had to do was figure out how to answer at least 20 of these 75 questions they were going to give me. And I think that created its fair, as you pointed out, level of anxiety. As an old person, you forget how fun it is to study for tests again and be on the other side of the table here as professors. Yeah. And then so a series of preparatory feelings, foundational pieces, artifacts, knowledge ultimately lead to me taking this permit test, which leads to a license, which leads to a job, which leads to world peace, as you say it.
Always.
Okay, great. So let's go ahead and think about our template a little bit here and figure out how we can guide everybody through it. So on our template, as always, you can watch this video as many times as you like, understanding, of course, where and how to execute an abstraction ladder. We've also included inside the abstraction ladder a couple of simple steps. So in this case, I've used a school example and understood that the measure below might be things like a classroom and the measure above that might be something like a district. We've also included an example here, which is about being a resident. So interestingly enough, in this example, we start with the most concrete example being a person named Jonathan.
Yep.
And funny enough, at the top of our ladder, we see civic wealth.
Yep.
How does someone actually take action, though, with the output of this exercise? I think it's obvious how it helps us organize at this point.
Yep. So I think there's two different ways that people take action from this. One is to try to understand what are the set of stories that sit around these different levels and how do they intersect with each other. It's one thing to talk about residents in a broad term, but then getting more concrete to say, what's Jonathan's experience? What does that look like? How does it play out? How does he interact with these systems? That can give really concrete details that can guide someone's project or what they're working on. At the same time, if you cannot solve the problems of residents, if you don't see the system that they're sitting within, so you would have to understand too, okay, what are the factors that influence civic wealth? One way I like to think about this, it's the toggle between being on the dance floor and being on the balcony. On the dance floor, you're seeing what's playing out around you, what's going on at that middle or lower levels, but occasionally you got to run up to the balcony and say, what's happening on the dance floor?
That's
People
right.
congregating toward the drinks? Are they everyone out of the room because the music's too loud? And I think that's a place of using these different levels to guide where you're starting with your innovation process.
I knew there was going to be an opportunity for me to do some sort of like robot dance in the middle of this. I felt that was going to be a lead-in for me.
That was pretty much what I was queuing you up for.
That's right. Okay, so now I understand. So this is not only an opportunity to understand where everyone is starting their system, but also see the scale up from the balcony and the scale down on being on the dance floor. I love that sort of storyline. What I also really like about this is it can probably change over time, right? I mean, as factors in the environment, the macroeconomic conditions shift. So should I think about once I've done an abstraction ladder as the be all end all, or should I do this, daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly? Like, how often should I think about these things?
Yeah, I think it's a great thing to revisit over time. One of the challenges at times when we're in rapid build test loops is we don't come back to this framing step and see, is this really the outcome that we want to pursue? We did some research and found that what we were looking at, why Nobel Prize winners are different than just your average scientist. And through that research, we saw that Nobel Prize winners can hold a really big question in their head. So Saul Perlmutter, his big abstract question is, what is the fate of the universe? Is it expanding or contracting?
Makes my head bend inward,
yes.
Which explains your thesis.
But then he can ladder down and say, hey, grad student, you should be doing experiment A today to move us a little bit closer to that end goal. And so I think for teams, it's a place, we're not all going to be Nobel Prize winners, or at least I'm not volunteering to be. But I think it's a place for teams to come back to, I'd say on the quarterly type basis, to think about, okay, we've been doing all of this work, we've been executing. Are we actually going to get to that larger outcome?
So it's a tracker mechanism as well.
Absolutely. And I think it can help set project priorities, but also make sure that people aren't stuck in the weeds. I see on my team at times, we're not on the dance floor or on the balcony, we're at the shoelace level, kind of staring at how someone tied that knot. That's being too low in that abstraction ladder. And it's a great flag to say, hey, we need to come up a little bit just to reframe and set some context on what are we trying to do here, and is it going to get us?
Got it. So not everyone can be a sneakerhead and be myopically focused on the shoes. I love the example. Okay, so like many of our templates, we have a number of form factors we have. So we have abstraction ladder 1 and 2. If you and I were on a team, whether we were solving some sort of universal good or inherently trying to figure out where consumer appliances are going, should we both do a ladder separately and then come together? Should we work on the same one? Any best practices, lessons learned about kind of where to get going and how to collaborate?
Yeah, I think it's always a place to do some divergence before you converge, just so you get a sense too of how team members see the system differently. Typically, even if we've worked together a lot, which we have, even if we're talking about the same problem space, we still have our own interpretation. And so it's great to do them separately, see those interconnections, and also see what does it spark that's between what both of us said. What are these different levels?
Well said.
I think it's also a place or a gut check that I always use when using abstraction ladders is just see if I can talk through it. There should be some logic to follow. I find that people either make one of two mistakes. They either say, Rachel, I'm just repeating the same thing. That means you're not making a big enough, you need to climb the ladder a little. You're not abstracting. Climb that ladder a little bit faster. Get to a different place of divergence. Or if you're saying that you jump to world peace immediately, people often do that make that mistake also. They jump too high.
It's at least 2 rungs to world peace. That's my general rule, no matter if we're designing cars or microwaves or whatever.
See, this is why you passed your motorcycle permit test, because you could make that leap.
Well said.
I think that's a place where just being able to talk through and draw your mental model, it's why I said it's an excellent thinking tool. Over time, this can become intuitive, but to start, you really need to put things down on paper and walk through your logic with it.
Really well said, Rachel. I'll tell you the other thing that I think a little bit about, I don't know if you have reactions to this, but a lot of times in an interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary teams, we have very senior people in the room. Yep. And if she or he is consistently the leader of the group, I also find that doing a little bit of that divergence and individual thinking and then coming together eliminates some of the bias of just do whatever the most senior person says. Has that been your experience as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think so much of what great design tools are good meeting management. They're democratizing. Well said. They make sure that everyone has a voice. And being able to put things on paper forces everyone to bring their voice to the table. It shows that senior leader, hey, there's other ways of thinking, because oftentimes as leaders, we also can assume that everyone thinks the same way as us, and that's a folly and something to frequently reflect on and give space for team members to push each other's thinking.
Really well said, Rachel. Well, thank you again for walking us through what turns out to be your favorite tool along the way. Please continue exploring. Don't be afraid to watch this video again. And please leave Rachel and I any comments, concerns, questions, or feedback, ways to improve this for any of you along our journey together. Thanks so much for dialing in.